Right, hello everyone. Let me see. Let's get started. Okay, so hi, I'm Laurie, and I've decided to get into this whole streaming thing. I'm currently a researcher at Oxford, though it's a little bit complicated because I'm on long-term sick leave due to various health bullshit. But fortunately, that's given me some time to invest in this and give this go. See how it goes. So I've got two main claims to fame, neither particularly notable, but something you may have heard of. So first of all, in 2006, when I was 16, I founded a group called Protest, which was set up around campaigning in favour of animal-based research, ethically justified, of course, um, and it was sort of set up around the construction of the animal lab that was currently kind of under threat from anti-vivisectionists during that time period, which has now been complete, and I've since done some work at it. Back when I had an animal license, um, it's been like taken away or anything. They just lapse if you don't use them. So my second claim to fame after that, I did that for a few years, and then went to university at Oxford and published a few papers, but this is far and away my most interesting and well referenced one, well cited. Um, so my area of interest is neurological implants, brain implants for treating things like Parkinson's disease and chronic pain and depression. Um, and I took an interest in cybersecurity in these devices. What happens if a hacker gets access to your brain implant and starts messing around with the settings? And that span out into this paper and a couple of others on the topic of brainjacking, a term that I coined. So yeah, that's kind of my background. And if you're here right now, there's a pretty good chance that you're a friend of mine because I've mostly just shared out the link to friends. Um, in which case, hello friends. Uh, you might have been wondering what I've been up to for the last however long it has been since I've been engaging with the wider world. So basically, for the last 18 months or so, I've been pretty severely depressed and suffering from range of medical bullshit, and not really engaging much with the outside world beyond kind of staring at horror in what's going on. Um, I've basically been self-isolating since long before it was cool. So that's left me without that much to do and that much like ability to engage in productive work. But hopefully this little thing here, a stream, will give me a bit of a creative outlet. Um, if you are just stumbling across this, nice to meet you. Hello. It's not all going to be personal nonsense. I'll get to more interesting stuff hopefully in a little bit. So, what am I doing here? Why am I on Twitch? Well, first of all, this is kind of all largely inspired by a appearance I made a couple of weeks ago, or well, last week, and then a week before that on Destiny's stream, a noted streamer. If you don't know him, you probably don't go on Twitch very much, but he's excellent. Check out his stuff. He was very kind to have me on stream to discuss some ideas that interest me, particularly surrounding effective altruism, and I found that experience very positive. So I figured that it might be interesting to set up my own stream so I can discuss topics that interest me, particularly focusing on topics that are either neglected, particularly within kind of wider internet discourse, or especially important, or ideally both. Um, so I should mention here a disclaimer about my expertise. Um, so first of all, I will try to give disclaimers wherever possible to indicate my kind of level of confidence in something or my level of understanding of a topic. I can reasonably claim to be an expert in pretty much one area, which is cybersecurity of neurological implants, and a few other little areas surrounding that related to neurological implants. Beyond that, I like to think I'm moderately smart and well informed as these things go, but basically beyond that, I'm a educated layman at best. Uh, that said, I think it's worthwhile my adding to the discourse online, and part of the purpose of this is to provide myself both a means and incentive to better structure and challenge my own beliefs. So I'm interested in engaging with the online discourse, hopefully improving my beliefs, and using this as well to record my thoughts, both as a reference to myself for later going back and identifying, what my beliefs were at any point in time, and to keep myself honest, so that I can't claim that my beliefs have never changed when they have, or vice versa. Not that I think I'm particularly prone to doing that, but everyone has lapses in memory and remembers things in a favourable light for themselves, so it's useful to have some kind of record. Um, but perhaps most of all, I'm hoping that this can be a platform to help me socialise a bit more with interesting people, especially people who I've lost touch with over the last year or two. Um, So this isn't going to be particularly polished, at least not to start with, but my intent here is to not let the best be the enemy of the good. I don't want to just put off putting stuff out there, putting content out there until I feel like I'm ready to go, because I have a tendency to do that, and results in me not ever putting anything out. I have many projects that I've just failed to push forward with. So what kind of content will be on here? Well, there will be plenty of me talking about topics that interest me, like say important things, particularly things like effective altruism, various issues around science and technology, just not just those in my specific wheelhouse, and stuff around ethics, particularly like neuroethics and bioethics, and the ethics of the far future, and kind of big topics like that. I'm also interested in getting people on to have chats with me. So if any of you out there listening would like to ring in and talk anytime, feel free to get in touch. Excuse me. Um, and potentially I might play some games on here. Jackbox I think might be quite fun. And also maybe show off some of my cocktail making skills. Not that I'm a great bartender, but I know how to make a drink, and I've got a pretty decent collection of booze, which is helping me ride out the pandemic. So just a quick word on the name. Why post normal? Essentially, I mean, first of all, it sort of sounds kind of cool, and of the portmanteau of two-word names that I came up with, it seemed to be the most popular among some friends. Um, and it sort of speaks to the fact that everyone's talking, like I say, everyone, a lot of people are talking at the moment about getting back to normal in the context of politics with Trump and Brexit and the rise of populist nationalism across the world and all this kind of stuff, and also in the context of COVID-19. I hear a lot of things about when are we going to get back into um, normal movement, normal everyday life. And I guess my position is that we're kind of past normal here. We are never going to return to the nice, easy days of, the mythical 1990s when everything was fine and the Soviet Union had collapsed and there was nothing to worry about whatsoever. Um, and to some degree, I think we need to embrace that and just recognize that shit's getting very weird. As the world is getting more complex, as we're developing more science, technology, more knowledge, more complex culture, things are just getting very, very strange, and everything's moving very quickly. And the thing to do there is to accept that and try to manage the risk. So that's something more broadly that I'm interested in talking about over the coming streams. Um, Oh, okay. So someone asking, what's my definition of effective altruism? Well, that's the kind of thing I was moving on to next, and the thing I mainly want to talk about tonight before I get into before we move on to fun games or whatever. Um, so, what is effective altruism? The broad definition I would say is that it's a movement and a um, collection of philosophers and philosophical arguments that center around the idea of doing the most good with the resources we have. And why should we do that? So I've got my rough argument here, 5 points. So one, we should do good generally. Um, Whatever we mean by good is very much up for debate, obviously. Um, But it's almost self-evident that unless you have some kind of philosophical subscription to being evil, we should generally do good. Second, we have limited resources. We don't have infinite resources with which to do good, and every one of us is limited in terms of finances, time, expertise, etc. So we can't help all problems at once, and it's generally good to sorry, it is best to do more good where we can. So all else being equal, with X amount of resources, we should give it to the cause that does the most good by whatever our definition is. Now, once we look at the evidence surrounding different causes, different interventions, it becomes apparent that the degree to which an act is good, for a given value, the amount of good it does, varies massively by orders of magnitude, and we can only know which interventions are best, which ones do more good than others, through careful study and, if not quantification, at least a sober and careful assessment of the potential outcomes and potential risks. So, my conclusion from those 5 points, if you agree with all of them, I think, is that we should expend some amount of resources, a substantial amount potentially, investigating how to do the most good, and then put the resources we can into the outcomes of those investigations, the most promising causes by our chosen metrics. So, how do we measure stuff? This is probably the biggest question in effective altruism and kind of in consequentialist ethics, is how do we actually compare the differences between two interventions, between two things that we can spend our resources on. Um, in the case of non-health interventions, so things like political change, in investing in long-term research, in improving the quality of life in a non-medical context, reducing racism, things like that, it's really, really, really difficult to quantify. And though I think you can make some kind of qualitative judgments, so say like the Civil Rights Act in the US almost certainly had more positive impact than a number of other pieces of legislation that year that may have taken a comparable amount of effort to write and uh, to implement. So we can make some kind of qualitative comparisons, even if there isn't exact numbers of, racist acts that happened in the subsequent year and in subsequent years to compare to. But when it comes to health interventions, there is a very good basis for comparing. And one of the main metrics used is the DALY, or Disability Adjusted Life Year. So a DALY is basically a lost year of 100% healthy life. So if you extend a life by 1 year at full health, or 2 years at 50% health, or 4 years at 25% health, or you improve 2 years of someone's life by 50%, or 4 years by 25%, etc., then you have averted one DALY. There are also a range of other metrics, but the DALY, I think, is probably the most widely used, and certainly in the kind of effective altruist sphere, it tends to be the one used for comparison purposes. Now, obviously, there are a lot of assumptions built into that. So, what is 50% health? Well, that's a health state where your quality of life is half what it would be if you were fully healthy. Okay, so how do we measure that? How do we measure quality of life and put that into quantities? It's a very fraught exercise and requires a number of assumptions and requires surveys of the people with these conditions and trying to correct for all sorts of biases in the populations we're asking. So it's by no means perfect, and it does rely on some assumptions about how we compare different people's lives, and really only shakes out on a statistical level. You don't want to be trying to directly compare individual people's suffering by saying, well, I'm blind, therefore each of my years of blindness is worth X value, but you have a broken leg and your suffering is worth Y value, therefore I'm suffering more than you, or you're suffering more than me. That kind of gets a bit tricky. But for the purposes of global health interventions and measuring the impact of dollars spent on a certain cause, the DALY does pretty well. So I mentioned that there's a very big margin between the least effective, or even the average, and the most effective health interventions, or causes in general. This is a very good demonstrator of that. So cost effectiveness, i.e., how many DALYs you avert, how many years of life 100% you save per $1,000. And these are all interventions for HIV and AIDS in the developing world. So the surgical treatment for Kaposi sarcoma, which is a very nasty form of cancer that is particularly common in patients with AIDS, is almost not visible on the scale. Antiretroviral therapy, which is pretty cost effective by the standards of developed world treatments and is used fairly widely in the developing world, is about one or two. Um, Preventing transmission in pregnancy gets more effective, condom distribution more effective, and then education for high risk groups gets you 27 or so DALYs per $1,000. We're talking about well over two orders of magnitude difference between the most effective and the least effective interventions. And of course, that doesn't mean that surgically treating people is never a good idea or is not worth doing. But when you have X amount of resources and you want to figure out what to do with them, if you're think about it, if you're buying something in a shop you've got £1 and you can either buy one can of beer or a can of beer that you like just as much for 10 pence. Obviously, you're going to go with 10 pence. You can get 10 cans of beer that you really like versus one. Um, why wouldn't we treat charity, wouldn't we treat interventions in just the same manner? And the fact is that there is a huge, huge amount of value in what's known as fat tails or heavy tails. Um, so these are distributions where the sorry, let me just these are distributions uh, of data where instead of with a normal exponential distribution that decays to zero, with a heavy tail distribution, you have uh, a lot of poor interventions, a lot of low value options, but then you've got a very, very long tail going out where there's a hell of a lot of very valuable, very high impact options. So if we compare this with some of the other great successes of the 20th century in terms of medical interventions, we can see that the best interventions have had tremendous, tremendous amounts of value. Guinea worm is one of the best examples here in terms of going from 3.5 million cases a year in the 80s to fewer than 5,000 a year today, all for the cost of approximately $350 million for the entire eradication program. That Jimmy Carter gets a hell of a lot of credit for this. Where's the um, so yeah, about $350 million for the entire program, approximately $5 to $8 per person treated, and the pure economic benefit from this is massive, which we find with a lot of interventions in the developing world, a lot of health interventions, is that shockingly making people healthier and more able to work improves not only their quality of life, but improves their ability to economically grow their community. With HIV eradication, um, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is a major USAID intervention, major global health program that was first implemented by George Bush, has spent approximately 80 billion since the early 2000s on eradicating HIV. And since then, we've seen a colossal decline in both deaths and new infections. And thanks to both those efforts and the efforts of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and a variety of world governments, we've seen this incredible, incredible reversal of one of the most terrifying epidemics that our species has ever faced. And what we can see from these, and there are many, many, many more examples, is that often some of the biggest gains can be realized by helping people who are quite far away from us. Though there's often a bias for understandable psychological and normative reasons towards helping those who are geographically close to us or who we know well or who are members of our nation or uh, uh, any other kind of grouping we care to place ourselves in. There's often a huge difference in the impact of what we can do between the world's richest nations and the world's poorest areas. There's a lot of very low hanging fruit unpicked in areas that we don't tend to look. And so, if we can focus on those areas and identify the areas that the causes that are going to have the biggest bang for the buck, then we can do a hell of a lot of good. So, before I kind of move on. Anybody got any questions or anything? Um, so here we go. No, don't apologise for it being distracting. That's absolutely fine. So this multi-criteria optimization problem further complicated by the benefit criteria not only being long-tailed but by being interlinked, non-orthogonal, fuzzy as it were. So what I think are you asking there that it's complicated by the fact that the uh, outcomes for any intervention are likely to be um, long term or okay. Okay, so that we've got kind of economic benefits, health benefits, all of these different positive outcomes, but it's difficult to measure and to separate each of them. Is that kind of what you're asking there? Um, excuse me. So, if so, good question, and very much so. The there's a whole bunch of yeah. So there's a whole bunch of research looking at, say, um, malaria or schistosomiasis or any of these neglected tropical diseases, and it's incredibly difficult to work out all of the benefits. And in some cases, well, all of these estimations that I'm using for, say, the Daly graph, um, that doesn't take into account the all the knock-on effects. And development economists do try to delve into these. So, for example, one of the biggest impacts of schistosomiasis treatment. Sorry, if you're not familiar, schistosomiasis is a neglected tropical disease that is that most of its life cycle is spent in these tiny little snails that live in fresh water, and people moving around in the water gets the parasite into them, and it infects them systemically. Now, schistosomiasis doesn't kill many people, relatively few people die as a result, but it causes fatigue and aches and cognitive problems and a whole bunch of uh, issues that sort of on their own would be relatively minor, but together make it very difficult to do things like go to school and hold down a job. And the main benefit of it isn't so much just the main benefit of treating it, sorry, uh, which is ridiculously cheap, like 20 cents or so per pill. The main benefit of treating it is the increase in years of education or ability to work, um, which has massive and relatively quantifiable economic benefits. But things like the benefit to people because they're able to think more clearly and enjoy their day more, or the fact that they're able to better take care of their partners, or the reduction in healthcare burden for the local hospitals. All these things probably occur and are probably good, but uh, just not really possible to quantify all of them in one study. So, okay, we can do different studies, one looking at the impact on healthcare burden, one looking at the like psychosocial impact. But look, sorry about that. My bloody headset ran out of power. Plugged in now. So yeah, as I was saying, unless you're going to study all of these different effects in one single population, you're going to get 20 teams of researchers to all come into not only one country but one sub-region of one country and start teasing out all these effects, then it's that you're not really able to like clearly pair them up. Um, Without doing a bunch of interpretation that is probably beyond me, but which makes the situation somewhat fuzzier. And so that's why we do really need to do the research, because the more research we can do, the better an idea we can get of all of these positive externalities and kind of indirectly filtered down benefits, as well as identifying any negatives associated with these programs. You can see things like certain development grants. There's concerns that if you give one family a very large grant and others don't get it, that it breeds resentment in a community. You can get people misreporting the health conditions they've got because they want to get some of the treatment that the like control groups in a study will get. The very presence of researchers in a community can bias the results. So yeah, this is all super hard to do. Um, but the better picture we get, the easier it is to compare interventions and to start making an informed judgment about what they do. Um, and probably the most research into this has occurred in the context of health interventions, and it's kind of why I'm speaking about it as a bit of an intro, because it's relatively easy to quantify at least the kind of first order direct impacts of an intervention like this. Um, when you get to what's the long-term economic effect, it gets more difficult, and particularly when you get to interventions that um, have that probably have very diffuse and very substantial positive effects, but that are so difficult to tease out from all of the other effects going on. So political activism is particularly comes to mind as something that can be extremely high impact. Um, going back again to the kind of civil rights thing, the stunt that Rosa Parks and her activist friends came up with is arguably one of the most positively impactful kind of single political acts in US history. Um, but if you were in the mid 60s trying to identify where to spend your money as someone who wants to support civil rights, it probably would have been quite difficult to predict that uh, supporting this one young woman sitting in the front of a bus would be your best path to advancing your political goals. Um, and I guess the kind of resolution to that is something I want to talk about more in the future. Um, Something that I need to read into more. But the resolution to that seems to be to just do one's best to try to predict what's going to be popular, to take advantage of uh, well-established concepts of campaigning, of political engagement, and try to use people's track records to identify who's going to be most effective. But like I say, this all gets a lot easier in the context of health interventions and of areas where we can kind of reliably um, quantify the outcomes. So now I'm just going to plug here the Give Well top charities. If you are interested in donating money, at the moment these are probably some of the best charities working in development and in international health. I particularly like Schistosomiasis Control Initiative is something I've been giving to for a while. Give Directly is, as I mentioned schistosomiasis earlier, Give Directly is fascinating. Um, instead of paying for health treatments, they instead just give direct cash grants to some of the world's poorest. And when done carefully, this seems to be remarkably a very, very good way of improving people's lives. Turns out that very often the world's poorest know, hello, sorry, my cat has just arrived, know what to do with money and know how to spend it. And then, of course, we've got the malaria interventions, so the Malaria Consortium and Against Malaria Foundation. AMF is very good indeed. These use bed nets, insecticide-treated bed nets, to minimise the spread of malaria, and this is particularly important in the context of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Um, so, loads. The burden on the healthcare systems in the developing world currently is very, very concerning. During the previous outbreaks um, of Ebola, there was a massive reduction in the attendance in hospitals of other conditions, almost certainly resulting in a substantial increase in disease burden. Um, and currently, there's a diversion of healthcare resources. There's people avoiding healthcare, not just going into clinics, but being frightened of healthcare workers and trying to stay out of their way. And of course, there's a diversion of charity resources, so fewer people are likely to be donating to these kind of charities as more of the world's focus is on coronavirus. So if you're interested in doing some good tonight or today or whatever time it is wherever you are, then I'd highly recommend giving to one of the malaria charities. Though, as I will cover at some point, it's not necessarily clear that the developing world is the very best place for our resources to go. It might be better for us uh, to focus on helping the far future, but that's a contentious one. So while I've kind of got a little pause here, has anybody got any questions or anything you're interested in my discussing? Let me just check my okay. In case anybody's wondering about this thing on my arm, it is a continuous glucose monitor. Um, well, technically it's not. Technically, if I can get it off. There we go. Technically, this thing is a continuous glucose monitor, and this thing is a little Bluetooth device that transmits the signal to my phone, where I have an app that monitors my blood glucose levels, and as a diabetic, that's very useful indeed because it means that it tells me if my levels are dropping. So, oh, my cat wants some treats. Um, so that is there to just keep me aware of things that might make me die. Um, yeah. So, yeah, I think. Where's my list? Let's see. Mm, uh, Sorry. Um, yeah. So I guess I'll chat about X risk a little bit. Um, so moving on from the kind of saving the developing world thing. Um, so we can buy a DALI or avert a DALI for something on the order of $50, somewhere in that kind of region. And we can save an entire human life uh, in a good health state for somewhere on the order of $2,500, which are both really, really good deals by the standard of um, sort of, well, all health interventions, but particularly health interventions in the developed world, excuse me, where a DALI might set you back $20,000 or more. Um, However, while this is the best we can do sort of right now, or may well be the best we can do on a large scale right now in terms of health treatments, there are a lot more potential people who we could affect in the future. Now, this does rely on one believing that future people have moral worth, which I think they do. It's something I'm interested in discussing in more detail at a later point. But for now, if we assume that people in the future have some kind of moral worth, even if we're discounting the moral worth quite substantially over time, uh, the sheer number of people who may exist in the future, if the world survives, is absolutely staggering. We are just at the beginning of our potential uh, long-term spread throughout the galaxy, and indeed the universe, if we can ever master even further travel. Um, and with 8 billion, or nearly 8 billion people alive at the moment, if we're able to spread out to hundreds, thousands, millions of planets, we can multiply that by many, many orders of magnitude. But we can only get to that stage. We can only get to a galaxy full of trillions and trillions of people all living their lives if, the world doesn't blow up in the meantime. Um, and there's a decent chance it might. Now, not being a loony, um, conspiracy theorist or doomsayer, the chances of our all dying in the next few years are pretty small. But over the course of centuries, the risk really, really adds up. And current best estimates by Toby Ord, a philosopher here at Oxford, and various others working in the field, place the risk of humanity being destroyed, our species either being wiped out or reduced to a state where uh, our potential future flourishing is drastically curtailed is perhaps something on the order of 1 in 6, which isn't as bad as it could be, uh, but it's also a single turn of a Russian roulette revolver. It's not the kind of odds that we really want to be betting on. Um, and we're currently only 200,000 years approximately into our species' existence. That's about 20% of the average mammalian species total existence based on the geological record. That's 0.01% of the time remaining until Earth becomes inhabitable due to the expansion of the sun. It's probably about 2 billion years. And it's almost nothing on the versus the lifespan of the universe. If we were able to spread out and fulfill our cosmic endowment, then it's not impossible that we could still be alive now when the formation of stars stops in 100 trillion years. And by that metric, we'd be 0.0000002% of the way through our species' lifespan. But of course, we've got to get there first, and we've got to survive. And currently, of the risks threatening us, uh, well, currently there are a lot of risks threatening us, and all of the big ones are pretty much all our fault. So, you climate change and biological weapons and nukes, these are all things that we've created and that we do have control over. Um, and reducing the risk from them has potentially absolutely massive cost effectiveness. So whereas it might be $50 to save one person's life today, or sorry, not to save life, to save a year of one person's life today, 2,500 or whatever to save a whole life, that money spent on research now to avert existential risks, to avert things that might cause the destruction of our species, could result in the saving of trillions of lives. Or that same bit of research might do absolutely nothing and have no impact. But if we plug in some basic assumptions about how likely research is to have an impact and how uh, uh, many lives we would be potentially saving by not having humanity blow up, it's pretty reasonable to guess that such research could have absolutely colossal positive impact, absolutely colossal cost effectiveness. That's especially, as well, the same goes for other forms of intervention to reduce existential risk, especially as they are currently extremely, extremely neglected, or many of them are. Um, so there are some areas where it's not too bad, say scanning the skies for asteroids and comets that could smash into us. This is actually an area where we are doing pretty good. We have a solid program for how to identify and classify these incoming projectiles. All of the ones that are big enough to cause a kind of extinction level event are likely to have already been categorized, or all the ones which are, vaguely likely to hit us and big enough. Um, and there's a solid range of technical proposals for what we would do if one was ever hurtling towards us. But biological weapons, which arguably are more of a threat, um, are very, very understudied, under controlled. So, for example, the Biological Weapons Convention, which is the main international vehicle, the vehicle for international law to ensure verification and compliance of biological weapons programs by nation states is currently gets less funding than a McDonald's. That's not McDonald's, the organizer, the whole business. It's a single branch of McDonald's. The average branch of McDonald's gets more funding than the entire biological weapons convention. They have 4 members of staff, about $1 million annual budget, and are responsible for uh, ensuring that all of the world's biological weapon stockpiles are carefully looked after. Obviously, countries have their own staffs, but as far as making sure everyone plays by the rules, it's basically a complete joke. Compare that to a more reasonable 80 million for the chemical weapons, 80 million a year for the chemical weapons convention, and uh, you start to see why there are perhaps some areas that we could do with spending some more resources in. Um, so these are things that give me concern, but there are some reasons to be a bit optimistic. So on most of the big threats, we probably have time to act. Um, the progress over the last few decades on issues like climate change and social justice, which, despite still not enough being done, they have picked up some serious traction, along with the positive outcome of the Cold War, and by positive I mean we didn't all blow ourselves up, do show that sometimes large-scale coordinated action on a relatively short time scale is possible. Um, and fingers crossed, I think possibly the most positive thing to come out of the current COVID-19 pandemic might be that we start to more seriously raise awareness of these kind of really big, terrifying biorisk issues that currently we're just not doing enough about. Um, so, as far as specific risks go, I'll just kind of run through those a little bit in case you're not aware, which, fair enough, most people aren't. Um, you can basically kind of break these down into two main categories, natural and artificial. Now, obviously, this is all complicated by the fact that some natural risks increase the likelihood of artificial risks, and vice versa, and the fact that some just don't really fit into super neat categories, but we'll break them down roughly as thus. So, on the natural side, excuse me, you've got the aforementioned meteorite hit. Uh, as far as devastatingness, a really big meteorite collision would potentially just completely wipe us out, but they are, as I said, relatively tractable as these things go. And you've got geological fuckery. So things like supervolcanoes, some kind of devastating magnetic pole, unforeseen magnetic pole issue, something like that. These are relatively infrequent. Well, the magnetic pole switching thing probably isn't even any kind of real extinction risk, but the supervolcanoes, um, probably pretty negligible. And we have some ways of dealing with the effects if one should happen. Uh, there are some weird things in physics. So supernovae, vacuum state decay, some uh, quasars, um, various exotic phenomena, some of which are only hypothetical, that could potentially destroy the planet. Fortunately, it appears that the frequency of at least the ones that we can observe is relatively low, and surprisingly, unless it's really close, a supernova in our vicinity might not do as much damage as one would kind of intuitively think. Um, then there's disease. So disease kind of very much straddles the border between natural and artificial, as demonstrated so ably by the COVID-19 pandemic. Uh, Regardless of the exact source of the pandemic, it's uh, pretty much certain that the novel coronavirus, originated in another mammal. And while this transmission was a sort of natural process, obviously there's a good chance that um, our species getting involved with animals and using them for meat or whatever was happening is a contributor towards the spread. Now, disease can potentially get really rather bad. We are relatively fortunate that though this current pandemic is undoubtedly very concerning, that the death rate isn't anywhere near the Black Death uh, wait, was that 14th century, 13th, 14th? Anyway, the Black Death. Um, and even the Black Death, which is the worst pandemic we've ever faced as a species, didn't come close to wiping us out. As far as existential risk go, um, it didn't really come close. Um, and that's the thing with disease. It doesn't make sense for a disease. It's not evolutionarily beneficial for a disease to kill all of its hosts. Now that doesn't mean it couldn't happen. There probably are species who've been wiped out by diseases, and a disease could sufficiently bad disease could cause a enough damage to this civilization that we would be unable to recover. But the chances of purely natural disease uh, giving rise to the death of our entire species are pretty remote. Um, and if such a thing would happen, as we've demonstrated at the moment, we do have ways of handling a rapidly emerging pandemic, even if many countries aren't nearly as good at it as they should be. So then you've got artificial risks, and these are the ones that we really need to worry about at the moment. Um, so the perhaps the most obvious one that gets talked about a lot in the context of the world ending is climate change, and climate change is potentially going to be really quite bad. Uh, in terms of forced migration, in terms of increased disease burden, and if there's some kind of uncontrolled runaway like positive feedback loop effect, then it's not impossible that it could make the Earth very difficult to inhabit. But the likelihood of it getting to the point that humanity couldn't survive, where we couldn't flourish, is pretty remote. It does require both the outcome to be the outcome of warming to be significantly worse than is predicted by even the most pessimistic models, and it probably relies on some substantial feedback loop effects, such as the methane, seafloor methane being released in massive quantities, causing further release of methane from, there's some other sources. Basically, there's various stores of particularly methane that could potentially be released if warming gets bad enough that could contribute to even more warming. But the likelihood of it actually wiping out the species is still pretty remote. Um, nukes. Nukes are concerning. We've got about 12,000, I think, nukes worldwide, warheads in the stockpiles and on active deployment. The US and Russia both have round about 6,000 each, and then there's comparatively a handful with the other countries. China's on we go. Apologies for that. I'm not sure what's going on with my bloody headset. I will try to have that fixed for next time. But yeah, so China's got 200, and the France and UK have like 150 or so. And then you've got India, Pakistan, and almost certainly Israel. Others, yeah. So the main concern with nukes really is that they're on kind of hair trigger alert. The US and Russia in particular are ready to drop them at the drop of a hat, even if we would hope that the political situation wouldn't lead to that. The fact is that there have been times when it's come quite close to accidentally setting off all of the missiles, most notably in 1962 around the Cuban Missile Crisis, and in 1983 around the Able Archer exercises that the US was conducting. In both cases, miscommunications led to us coming perilously close to a nuclear war being started. Now, the silver lining with nuclear war is that there's been quite a lot of research into how to survive it, and even in the worst nuclear winter scenarios, it's unlikely that everywhere would be uninhabitable. Um, Most of the population might die, but there's a very big difference between killing 99% of the human population and 100%. 99% means centuries, maybe a millennium of relative dark age, but then an opportunity to flourish once again, whereas 100% means the entire loss of all of our potential. So actually wiping out our species is harder to do than one might expect. Um, However, if one were trying to do it and wanted to do so on a budget, one might use our next entry, which is engineered pandemics. So currently, there exists the possibility to. This is a particularly good paper on the topic. If you're interested. Um, Currently, there exists the possibility to go online, go to a one of dozens of websites for scientific supplies, and to order up a gene construct. So you put in your order details, and you will receive in the mail a bunch of genetic material that you can plug into cells and will produce any biological matter you want, pretty much. Now, obviously, it's a bit more complex than it sounds there, but nevertheless, it's not that complex, and it's the sort of thing that a couple of smart science fair students have done as a demonstration at kind of high school level, and even for relatively advanced applications, it's the kind of thing that a team of grad students with a decent bit of funding could engage in without much trouble whatsoever. Now, these companies do have some safeguards in place, but the safeguards are far from perfect, and not all of the companies do have them. The responsible ones do, but not all of them are responsible. And it only takes one irresponsible company or one person capable of doing this at home to get access to the genome for, say, the 1918 Spanish flu, influenza pandemic, to tweak that a bit, as has been demonstrated in the labs in particularly country it's from, but the H5N1 gain of function experiments mentioned there, somewhere down there, um, were particularly concerning as it involved taking this dangerous strain of flu and adding functions into it and enabling it to, through selective breeding, I think, to spread more effectively. Uh, so either if a lab experiment were being undertaken that got out into the wild, or a bad actor, a grad student with a grudge, or a group of terrorists who wanted to cause some real problems. By real problems, I mean potentially the death of the species. Um, then the barrier to entry keeps on coming down. Uh, it's kind of the corollary of Moore's law is every 18 months the IQ to required to destroy the world goes down by X amount. Um, and this is the challenge we face ourselves with is increasing access to technologies, particularly technologies in certain specific fields, does a massive amount of good and improves our lives and often helps fight some of the other sources of risk, whether that's in terms of global health interventions that I was mentioning earlier. Our ability to use biotechnology to produce new vaccines is unparalleled and incredible. Um, or whether that's an existential risk, the our ability to engineer uh, uh, biological constructs can enable us to fight all kinds of risks. It can help us fight climate change. I believe there's a species of bacterium that's being investigated for cleaning up radiation spills. There's so much we can potentially do with bioscience, but it is in many ways a Pandora's box, and currently there is just not enough control over this area of very concerning technology. Um, and anyone watching this who is a long-term friend of mine probably recognizes right now that I am a fair bit less blindly optimistic about the prospects of certain technologies than I used to be. But I think it has come time to face up to the fact that there are areas of technological development that we need to be extremely careful about. Another one of those is artificial intelligence. Um, Now this can be a subject for a whole different talk, and I need to reread a couple of books before I do that. But the popular image of artificial intelligence kind of taking over the world with Terminator drones and slaughtering people and so forth, is probably not going to happen. Um, it's not impossible, but killer robots and the problem with AI are more subtle and potentially more concerning. So without getting too ridiculously deep into this, the core issue that most people working in AI safety are looking into is goal alignment. So this is working out how to make sure an entity that is capable of kind of human level interaction follows not only the goals we set for it, but also the goals we would set for it if we were smarter, which particularly becomes an issue with any entity that is able to recursively self-improve itself. If it's able to make itself smarter and realizes some flaw with the rules we've set for it, when in our limited human cognition, then there's a distinct possibility of it engaging in behavior that mismatches with our goals. And it might just realize that if it engages in that behavior, it's going to displease us. And if it displeases us, we might try turning it off. So it could act in uh, uh, with patterns of behavior that are very restrictive to us or are just hostile with our existence. And it's not that the AI would hate us and want to kill us all for no reason, but just that the fact that we have misaligned goals from it, or it has misaligned goals from us, depending on your perspective, I suppose. All hail our new AI overlords. The fact that our goals misaligned means that it's inherently going to come into conflict, and when the goals of an anthill and a gardener are misaligned, generally the gardener wins. Um, and in this analogy, if we have a artificial general intelligence, a generally capable AI that is on similar level of cognition or greater to humans, um, and is able to improve itself to the point that it's far greater, then it may well be as different from us as a gardener is from some ants. So really, that's a topic I need to uh, be kind of more properly prepared for, I think. And like I said at the start, one of the purposes of my doing this stream is that I'm not trying to jump into being perfect. So apologies that I can't just deliver a full. I mean, I could, yeah. Now, I've spoken about natural, artificial threats, but there's a kind of another area which is the unknowns, um, things that we don't know could threaten us. And in the case of natural phenomena, the discovery of supernovae and quasars, and the possibility of weird phenomena like vacuum state decay, and the cycle of stellar evolution. These are all things that we've only learned about in the last century or so. The presence of global warming, of climate change, is something that we've only really been aware of for maybe 40 years, um, in any form. The risks posed by biotechnology and bioengineered pathogens are something that we've only really been aware of for maybe 20 years or so. Um, if you go back into sci-fi, there's probably some stuff with genetic engineering going back a bit farther, um, but not hugely. My point here is that there are a lot of big threats that we have only become aware of very recently, at least in the kind of scale of human history. And it seems unwise to assume that we are completely out of them. There's a pretty good chance uh, that there are still some hidden physics phenomena out there that could cause us substantial harm, and there's perhaps the even more concerning possibility that there is some easy to create arrangement of matter that is potent enough that it could do a lot of harm in the hands of a madman. So, what do I kind of mean by this? Nukes are scary. We'll agree that. We've already been through that, big boom, nuclear winter, all that bad shit. But they are difficult to make. So a dedicated team of half-competent physicists and engineers with access to the right materials could build a pretty serviceable nuclear bomb, probably over the course of a year or two. The plans, very detailed plans, aren't fully publicly available, but there've been studies where amateurs have put together plans that would probably work. Might not be optimally effective, but fortunately, however, getting highly enriched uranium or plutonium is incredibly difficult. It's extremely, extremely hard to do without the kind of resources that basically only nation states have. Um, and the scary thing about synthetic biology is the fact that it lowers that barrier to entry. It lowers both the intelligence you require and the resources you require to make something that could potentially threaten our entire species. So, one of the things that kind of keeps me up at night is, what if we discover that taking two common household cleaning products, mixing them in a bowl, um, and covering them in duct tape and chucking them in a microwave creates a weapon of comparable power to nukes or engineered diseases or so forth. Now, obviously, in that case, it's probably not going to do much more than create a mess and maybe some chlorine. But the possibility of that kind of state of matter, the arrangement of matter, of something that we discover and it turns out to be far more dangerous than we'd anticipated, that does give me some cause for concern. So, yeah, I guess for any of you who aren't already familiar with some of these ideas, that might all be a little bit terrifying. Um, I know I worry about it a lot, but fortunately there are some things we can do to help. Um, so pushing for more research, I think, is the kind of big topic here. There's just so much that we don't know about the technological risks that are facing us, and natural risks that are facing us over the next century or more, that there's a real opportunity to fund and to get involved with high impact research into this topic. There are a few groups worldwide looking into these kind of issues specifically, and obviously looking into these issues generally, and some of the specific issues do have a lot of funding, and a lot of effort going into solving them. But more research is needed, and more can be done to invest in these areas. And like as I said a few minutes ago, the one real sort of saving grace of COVID-19 might well be that it gives us an actual motivation to take really seriously the big problems that are facing us. We haven't had a pandemic this large or this terrifying in more than a century. Um, and I think in many ways people have been complacent about the risk posed by them. During the SARS and swine flu and bird flu epidemics, there was a lot of, well, the media is just blowing it out of proportion, and everyone's getting scared over nothing. And to some degree, in those cases, the fact that they didn't have that really killer combination of high mortality rate and high reproduction rate, um, meant that there was cause for perhaps not being too concerned. But certainly earlier on, when information was just coming out and was vague, um, I think a lot of people dismissed the concerns unnecessarily. Not least because nobody today, or practically nobody today, lived through the last big pandemic. And if you haven't experienced that kind of, or at least read about and looked into that kind of event. It just seems almost implausible that society would shut down and that so many people would be affected by this invisible killer. And yet, everyone's finding out now that it is a really big fucking deal, and we're losing very large numbers of people. Fortunately, not as large as we could be losing, but the trade-off for that is, or to some degree, the trade-off is obviously not a one-to-one trade-off, but part of the trade-off for that is that we are all having to stay home and cower. Um, so bringing it back round to the kind of original point of why I'm doing this is I think now is a good time to start discussing some of these issues. I think now is a good time to be taking seriously the really big topics that face us as a species, and I would like to try to be a small part of that, and rather than just sitting around doing nothing. So hopefully this stream is going to be somewhat of an informative experience for people. Um, so I think I'm going to stop with the rambling quite so much. Though if anybody in chat has any questions or anything, please do let me know and I will happily field them. Um, oh, hey, nice person. Nick, if you're watching, hello, lovely to hear from you. Uh, yeah, so, um, I think, oh, there you are. Nick, old chap, how are you? Um, oh, right, what I might suggest is if anybody's interested, play a little bit of Jackbox. I can set up the game, and might be fun to do a little bit of socializing and maybe chat about something that isn't the impending death of our species. Um, because as important a topic as it is, it can get a little bit depressing at times. Let's see. Right, if Steam wishes to load. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to, I think I'll load some Quiplash, and I'll get that going. Then I'm just going to go sort out my blood glucose a little bit, and I'll give some time for everyone to join in. Let's see if this works. This is my first time trying to do a game while streaming. Okay, well it just didn't load. Hmm. There we go. Right. Thank you for watching, Ollie. I'm glad you enjoyed. And yeah, we're over the serious bit, so thank you very much. Take it easy, and yeah, next stream will probably be Wednesday. I'm gonna try to do a reasonably regular schedule, and take this somewhat seriously, even if it's just an hour or so. Be nice to check in with people. So yeah, take it easy, Ollie. Glad you enjoyed, and yeah, right. GMT. Yeah, 8 o'clock. Sorry, I'll just 8 o'clock British time. So that's, I don't know how it works with bloody daylight savings and whatnot. Um, just 8 p.m. 8 p.m. UK time. Right. Okay. Can anyone tell me if the sounds are getting? Oh yes, yes. 4 p.m. EST. Is it 4 p.m. EST? Either 4 or 5. Uh, oh, if you came at 5 p.m. I don't know how bloody daylight savings work. Why can't we all just get rid of it and everyone use GMT? Or literally any other time zone, I don't care. Uh, right, okay, yeah. Yes, thank you. Let's just do away with time zones. I will happily get up at 10 a.m. or 10 p.m. or whatever fucking time, but it doesn't matter. It's all arbitrary. So let's all just standardize so that we can, actually coordinate things online. Because everyone's online all the time now. I'm going to completely ignore the 2 billion or so people who don't have internet connections and the maybe 3, 4 billion people who aren't heavily online. But yeah, ignoring all of them, we should completely standardize time zones and make everyone speak one language as well. Don't care which one it is. Happy with uh, just mind blank Esperanto. Let's all learn Esperanto. Anyway, right, absolutely, absolutely. So let's do some Quiplash. Uh, so yes, we will connect to this and oh shit. Okay, let's try that once more with feeling. Um, does Party Pack 4 want to work? This is mildly frustrating. But thank you for hanging on in there, loyal viewers. Uh, okay, this just isn't working. Okay, tell you what. Bye, Nick. Right. I think I'm going to leave it there, and rather than frustrating myself with making that work, um, I'll get that working, and on Wednesday we will do some jackbox, and we will have some games. But I hope everyone enjoyed, and yeah, I'm reasonably happy with how that first stream went. So just once again, if you are considering donating to any charities, Against Malaria Foundation, very, very good. All of these are great. Check out givewell.org for your up-to-date, high-impact, evidence-based charity recommendations. And if you want to get a bit deeper into it, look into EA funds. I'll talk about those in detail some other time. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone who watched, and everyone who's watching back later on YouTube or whatever. And I hope everyone has a lovely Wednesday evening, or whatever the hell time of day it is, wherever you are. It doesn't matter. It's all Wednesday evening now because we've decided. Although, no, if we standardized world clocks, evening would still be relative to your local time, so that wouldn't work. Well, either way, bye.